I'm just going to go.
I think we might be there.
I think we're live now, yeah.
So we're live now. That's great. Thank you, Linda.
Tamara, if you just continue on, and then we'll recap once you get to the end of that section.
That's fine. So recommendation to ask school forum to agree the level of central funding for the early years.
YouTube's still whirring. YouTube's still whirring here. Is it?
Linda?
Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. So that's okay. I can't remember if you remind me.
Sorry, I can't pop Linda on mute. If you can all hear me, so schools forum members are asked to agree the 5% centrally retained budget for the early years from the early years block for 22-23. Okay, over to you, Paul. So I think we're asking schools forum to agree that level of funding.
Oh yes, thanks, Tamara. I'm sorry, colleagues, I should have stated at the start, if you've got any questions, to raise your hand, and if you want to speak, if you could put your camera on when you're speaking and then turn it off and mute when you're not speaking. With regards to the early years block, has anybody got any questions, any issues they want to raise? No? Thanks. So I think that we've noted and agreed the recommendations for the early years block.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. So moving on now to the schools block. So recommendation 4 asks forum to note the value of the schools block and the commitments against that block. That's set out in the report, the body of the report. And then also note the indicative allocations to individual schools, which are set out in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. So Kim, if you'd like to just summarise the updates on that and adjustments to the formula for affordability.
Yeah. So it's set out, so we're moving to page 22 of the report, so 22 of 38. So as Tamara mentioned earlier, so this section just sets out the decisions that were made at the November meeting with regards to the schools block, and then sets out the schools block grant allocations. So table 4 on page 22 sets out the level of the grant allocation. And then appendices 1 and 2 set out a summary of the formula factors and the indicative budget allocations for maintained schools and academies. So the total allocation to schools has indicatively increased by just over 7 million between 21-22 and 22-23, despite an overall pupil reduction. And that, as the Appendix 1 shows the comparison with last year, both at an overall budget level and a per pupil basis. And where there are reductions in budgets for schools, those are largely related to pupil number reductions, because the formula factors have increased across the board. Appendix 2 sets out the formula factors compared to last year. So in November, we'd set out our intention to set those formula factors at the national funding formula wherever possible. But once we've received the allocation, it was necessary to do some adjustment to those formula factors for affordability purposes. So this is largely due to a significant increase in free school meal rates over the past year, and that has led to a affordability gap for the with the national funding formula. So what we've done, as agreed in the November forum, that we would is scale back the prior attainment factor and the FSM 6 factor. So we've scaled back the increases on those factors. So those factors still increase from the position they were last year, but by a slightly lower amount than the national funding formula increase to make the formula affordable. But as I said, the vast majority of the factors are set at the national funding formula. It's just that prior attainment factor and the FSM 6 factor that was scaled back for affordability. On page 23 of the report, we also set out the school details of the school supplementary grant. So in December, when the schools block funding was announced, the DfE also announced that schools would receive a school supplementary grant in 22-23. So this additional funding has been allocated largely to provide support for the cost of the health and social care levy on the national insurance, as well as any kind of wider funding pressures that have come since the original allocations were agreed. The indicative value of that across all Ealing schools is just under 8 million, and we've set out on page 23 the sort of criteria that those allocations will be based on. So those allocations haven't been announced yet because there's an element of those allocations that's related to the Free School Meal 6, which the allocations which get announced in the spring. So those allocations will be announced in the spring, and those are an additional sum on top of the main schools block allocation.
Thanks, Kim.
I think, I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Tamara.
Does anybody want to ask any questions with regards to item 4 and 5? No, thank you. We'll move on to item 6 and 7. Tamara, Kim.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Kim, do you want to cover this?
I can. So item 6 and 7 cover the dedelegation for the trade union duties. So the education function and dedelegation section of the report starts on page 24. The education function funding was agreed. The 50p increase to £28 was one of the decisions that was made in November, and the majority of the dedelegation decisions were also made and agreed in November. But Forum agreed to bring this decision on the 2% increase for trade union functions to the January meeting. So agreed that the current level of funding and to bring the 2% increase to this meeting. That was so the colleagues could go back and have further discussion at head teacher representative groups, and I've set out at the top of the page 25 the key points for forum members to note in making the decision. So these relate to the fact that the difference between the primary and high is a historic decision and doesn't result in the cross subsidising. The fact that while there was a 0% pay award for teachers in 21-22, the TU facility funding covers both teaching and non-teaching staff, and there's still an outstanding claim on the non-teaching, and also that this is a financial year decision rather than an academic year decision in terms of the timing. That the proposed 2% increase broadly maintains the existing levels of funding because of the reducing pupil numbers, and also that while the pupil numbers have decreased, the staff numbers are broadly stable across the maintained sector at the moment, and there's in demand for TU facility time as schools rationalise resources and reorganise staffing in response to falling numbers. So the decision for there's a separate decision for maintained primary schools and maintained secondary schools to make on that 2% increase. Marion, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just to say that I know that the secondary heads hadn't met and fully discussed it at the last meeting. We have subsequently met and said we'd support the 2%. So just thought I might as well say that now in terms of the vote. I think I know that we weren't 100% sure last time, but we've all agreed that now.
Thanks, Marion.
And also just to mention the correction that needs to happen.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
It's 407 for primary and 286 for secondary. Yeah,
so the table set out and the values set out in the table are correct, but in the recommendations it's the wrong way around.
Is in terms of agreeing this, our primary colleagues minded to agree the 4.7? Any objections? And secondary colleagues, the 2.86. Any objections? Okay, so that's agreed. Thank you, Kim. And then item 8, which is to agree in principle the level of funding to replace the 50% reduction in the school improvement and brokerage grant for 22-23. Tamara, you're on mute.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll pick this one up. So the recommendation currently says in principle In my introduction to the report, I mentioned that the government had published the outcome of the consultation and confirmed that they'd be reducing the value of the grant by 50% in 22-23 and then ceasing the grant entirely the following year. In the publication today, it was quite clear that the intention was that there'd be a mechanism for de-delegation of funding specifically for schools improvement functions for maintained schools. And the rationale behind the government's decision was to align the approach for maintained schools with academies who currently fund school improvement services from their own delegated budgets. So the report sets out, provides a summary of the core functions that the grant's currently used for, and the decisions that we're asking Forum to take are in first part to agree the principle of maintaining the overall levels of funding for schools improvement functions as the LA works with schools to determine the future approach locally and to agree funding arrangements. And so that's the first part of the decision is for schools to agree that the level of funding will be met from either de-delegation or reserves, but the overall value of the budget will remain the same.
So is Forum minded to agree maintaining for 22-23 the amount? Any objections? No? Okay, so we've agreed the amount. So then is how are we going to fund the amount? Tamara, do you want to?
And so the report sets out a range of options for funding. So as I mentioned, the government's intention is to amend the school funding regulations to allow for de-delegation of school improvement functions in agreement with maintained schools. So the options for schools for 22-23 are to fully or part fund the school improvement functions from a de-delegation, or during the transition period to fund in part or in full from reserves. And from the options we set out in the report, we remind Forum members of the previous use of reserves and the potential impact around high needs deficits. And although the report doesn't specify a local authority preference, but we're suggesting schools consider a 50-50 split of that funding arrangement, so 50% from reserves and 50% from de-delegations. Because this is a de-delegated item, primary and high school members would need to vote separately on that. So the report on page 27 sets out the funding rate for that. So for primary, a 50-50 de-delegation versus reserves would be a de-delegated rate of £2.52, and for secondary that would be a rate of £1.71.
Thanks, Tamara. So further to this, as Tamara mentioned, is the transition year, and there will have to be a substantial amount of work done with regards to the future of this grant and how it applies to the school sector. But mindful that we've agreed it for 1 year, the proposal of a 50-50 split, does anybody have any questions or objections to that? Dave has a question. We did discuss in the late autumn, please remind how the current reserve came about. Did you see the question, Tamara?
Yes, thanks, Paul. So the current reserve was reported as part of the summer Forum report, and it came about from underspends from the growth fund in previous years and an underspend from the early years contingency in previous years. So those underspends are one-off in nature, and and so they were set out at that point in time. The overall reserve left across all the blocks of the DSG as at March 21 was, I think it was 371,000, which is set out in the report, which is a very, very small reserve. And by the end of the current financial year, the overall DSG is likely to be in deficit as a result of the high needs pressures. But each of the blocks of the DSG has the reserves are accounted for separately, and there are decisions that are made with Forum about the use of those reserves.
Thanks, Tamara.
Tamara, it's Ian. Am I right in thinking that the total amount that would come out of those reserves, if we went down the route that we're proposing of 50-50 and 50% of the current grant, means that it would be about 75k that would be allocated for this purpose in this year? Is that if I picked that up correctly?
It would be for the 22-23 financial year.
Yeah, for this year.
Yeah, so £79,000, because it'd be the half of that,
right.
158,000.
Fight over 4k. Okay, I get it, and it sounds affordable, but it's going to become unaffordable going forward because we won't have any reserves in the future year, presumably.
Overall, in the DSG, there are unlikely to be reserves now.
Sure.
And any underspends on specific areas within the DSG will come back to Forum for decisions around its use, as it was this year.
Sure. Thank you.
Dave, I don't know if you want to come in because you've posted in the chat, but I'm not sure how that presents back through the meeting broadcast.
I'll try. It's just my microphone on my laptop sometimes is not very good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was just because this seemed to be a one-off reserve, as you just called it, and this is a one-off request for the initial funding to allow the longer time for the consultation to come up with a long-term solution. I know when we did meet late in the autumn term, we talked about a wide range of options for this, and given that we already year after year and have again agreed to give 0.5% of the main block over to high needs, this seems one of those one-off things that more should come from the in-year reserve that built up, not entirely, but more, which would allow us that time scale to do the proper consultation for the longer term future. That was just my own view on it.
Okay, so I think there was a view that 50-50 was the majority held view. Does anybody want to further bring up any issues with regards to the suggestion that Dave had?
Hi, Paul. Sorry, I can't see how to raise my hand anymore. I lost that button. I don't know. But I in the conversations we had prior to this, and even thinking now, I can't help but agree with Dave, and just saying that, schools, I think, would appreciate in this particular circumstance, which obviously was kind of unexpected for most people, that the in-year surplus, as it were, be used to fund the majority of this unexpected expense, because it's highly likely that schools are going to be bearing the brunt of this in the future. But then they can have time to adequately budget and plan over a couple of years to factor this in. Whereas right now, lots of schools, and speaking as a Southall quadrant chair, knowing that, they're all running a pretty heavy deficit moving forward, even a few £1,000s more out of their budget, could be the difference between a teaching assistant or a teacher or a member of staff. And I think the more that can be taken out of this reserve, the better in this first instance.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Does anybody else have any comments? So I wonder what way is the best way to proceed on this in terms of the options. So we generally have a 50-50 split or a 33-66.
Paul, do we now need to agree a split, which can be put as another option? Is it the 75-25, or
No.
is there something else?
I think we're best.
Sorry, Paul, go on.
I think we're best to stick because this could be high, this could become extremely complex for such a small amount of money. I think if we agree 50-50 or 33-66.
Yeah, so 3366 isn't set out in the report, but if we can agree the percentages, and we'll confirm, I'm sure Kim will do the quick maths that I'm not able to do right now to confirm what the rates would be. I wonder, it may or may not be relevant, but I had a sense, particularly from the conversations, say, around trade union facilities, that primary and high colleagues were reasonably keen to have an agreed approach across the sectors, just in terms of the proportionate contribution from reserves versus de-delegation. I'm not sure, is it worth having how would you want to proceed, Paul? Would it be worth having a show of hands?
Or do the secondary colleagues have a view on the split? No. Marion?
I think, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to unmute, finding the right buttons. I think we to be honest, we hadn't considered beyond the paper. So we were kind of looking, I think the 50-50 was the one that we were considering. So I'm like, I don't know what secondary college would think about that. I don't know whether Rasheen, oh sorry, no, because it's the maintained schools. So if anyone wants to come in and see what they think, but I know that our discussions were around the 50-50. And that's the basis that we'd consulted with the other maintained school heads.
If it helps to, Paul, if it helps to understand what those numbers would mean,
yeah,
so a 3366 would mean funding just under 105,000 from the reserves, rather than the 79,000 we would be talking about on 50%, and the rate would be hang on, £1.68 for primary schools and £1.13 for secondary schools.
God, Kim, you're a whiz. Like Cornelia is on her technological, you're I tell you. Dr. Jeremy Hannay.
Thank you, Sir Paul. I mean, listen, I think, we can all probably appreciate that the difference between 50-50 and 66-33 is marginal in terms of the monetary amount per school and from the reserve. I think this is probably more for schools about optics and about a relationship between the local authority and schools, in saying that, if a school encountered an unexpected expense, there would be a large amount that the school itself would be expected to cover through cumulative surplus. And I think that in this particular instance, where this is a local authority unexpected expense, it would go a long way for schools that are under lots of pressure in Southall to see that the local authority is bearing the brunt of this burden, even if the difference at the end of the day is going to be £500 per school. I think that the optics and the packaging of that would go a long way between furthering a really positive relationship between schools and the local authority.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. So I think the best thing to do is if we could do a quick vote. So Tamara, it's set by sector, primary maintained and secondary maintained?
Yeah.
So for primary maintained, if you could raise your hand for 50-50. Mike, 1, 2. Am I allowed to vote?
Call out who is in the sector, so everyone's clear about who's able to vote.
Sorry?
Would it be helpful for me to call out the sector, the colleagues in the sector?
So
Paul and I are allowed to vote, by the way.
You're in the specialist sector.
Okay.
Right.
Paul asked the question too. So,
so 4 for 50-50 maintained. Oh, John. 5. Sorry. 5. John, did you?
So John is in the Prue sector, so he's not able to vote.
Okay. So 5 for the 50-50.
Yeah.
And then for the 66-33 in primary. So that is Jeremy and Dave. So primary will go for 50-50. And then in secondary, 50-50. Mia, Rachel, Marion, and Nora.
That's all with the secondary maintained sector colleagues, yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So we'll go for 50-50. I think it's probably apropos to say that there would need to be a pretty urgent piece of work done in this transition year to really move this issue on. And I'm sure it's high on Julie's agenda, but I think we would need to, because we'd need to start discussions in the autumn term about how we're going to proceed with this. So unfortunately, that's a piece of work for you, Julie.
I think well before the autumn, Paul, I think it's going to be rumbling from now until next year.
Marion, have you got a legacy hand up there, or no? You've got a. Do you want to comment?
I actually wanted to come in on the point that you were making, because I think we found it quite. I think we've all found this issue quite difficult to understand and then to grapple with all the implications. And I just think there's going to be a real need for us to, harking back to what Jeremy was saying in our last meeting, like making sure that the consultation documents, if we're issuing them to all schools, are issued with sufficient information and background so that everyone fully understands them. I just think it's a massive piece of work. It's scarily large, but I think it's quite important we start it as quickly as possible so that people can feel confident making the decisions, because they're going to be tricky ones next year, I think.
Thanks, Marion. Jeremy?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that I think that in terms of high schools have a very slick consultation process between them set up and established already, whereas for primary members of the schools forum, we don't often kind of go out to the wider body. But I think in this particular circumstance, making a decision between primary colleagues early about how we want that consultation process managed, whether it's going to be through quadrants or some other established function or just through ourselves, I think it's going to be really important so that we can garner kind of the widest viewpoint on how we take this forward.
I agree, Jeremy. Thanks. Sue?
I was agreeing. I think it probably needs not just to be a piece of paper. I think it needs to be coming to the head teachers' meetings, so that everybody is hearing the same message at the same time. In quadrants, if we're taking it back, we may not quite understand, but I think it's so important that it needs to come to full meetings.
Absolutely, Sue. Thanks very much. Thank you, colleagues. We'll draw that issue to a close. So thank you. Oh, Tamara, you then need to, Tamara and Kim need to comment on item 9 and 10, high needs block.
So if I can just come in on just the last point around consultation. So just to clarify the timeline. So the local authority consults on the funding for the following financial year at the beginning of the autumn term. So to enable us to, as Jeremy, Sue and Marion have rightly said, clearly set out the options, the background and the rationale, and to do that additional consultation, face to face with the relevant groups, we really need to have a clear direction of travel in the summer term. Otherwise we won't be ready in time. So just to kind of set that out. So we'll probably need to come back to forum in the summer as part of that report as well.
Are you saying, Tamara, that your concern is there's two major consultations running parallel, which is around school forum, school block monies, and also the future of the school improvement grant?
Well, they're the same. They're one in the same. So the government has set out its intention that the relevant functions, are funded through dedelegations, and schools will be making those decisions off the back of the consultation that we run in the autumn term. So to inform that consultation, there would need to be some work in the summer around what the various options are, and the preferences of the various sectors and groups of schools around that, so that it can inform any proposals the LA is going to make. Because we'd still be seeking to come back to forum in November to make the bulk of the decisions where we can, where reasonable.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Tamara.
Okay, so the last two items are just in relation to high needs. So if schools forum members will note the value of the high needs block, and also note that there have been additional monies put into the high needs block in relation to the national insurance changes, as it has been with the schools block. The difference between high needs and schools is that they haven't set out a mechanism for allocating that funding to schools, and there's a wider use of that element of grant, which is to fund wider pressures resulting from COVID and high needs growth, and also the changes in the national insurance and cost to schools. So I'll be working with schools in the spring so that we can publish those allocations for budget setting. And recommendation 10 just asks officers to come back in the spring around the high needs deficit recovery planning and SEND strategy.
We're hoping, Tamara, to have some foresight of that just before the Easter break.
Yes, so the timeline for that report will be completed in March, and we'd hope to convene a pre-meeting with forum reps in March.
Super, thanks, Tamara. So that brings us to the end of the school forum report. Cornelia, for the purposes of the live meeting, do you want me to quickly run through the first 3 or 4 agenda items?
Yes,
Yeah.
please, Chair. That would be helpful. Thank you for completeness.
So item number 1, apologies for absence and substitutions. There were none, Cornelia?
I didn't receive any, no.
Okay, there were no urgent matters?
No.
There's no matters to be considered in private?
No.
No declarations of interest? And forum members, item 5, forum members are agreeing the minutes from the November meeting.
Okay, thank you.
And we've also, forum has also noted the current membership, that its forum is substantially full with the exception of 2 vacancies.
Thank you. Noted.
So the next meeting, hopefully, fingers crossed, everybody, on the 27th of April will be an in-person meeting. And is that the trajectory we're working on, bar no global outbreaks? Is that okay, Cornelia?
It's okay in theory, but just to make you aware, I don't know if you are, that forum can meet virtually. It's one of the meetings that the government has. There was an update to the guidance, the schools forum guidance, that said schools forum could meet virtually.
Iram has asked, can we do a hybrid? I don't know how technologically possible that is.
Hybrid is possible.
Hybrid
is possible, yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep that option on the table.
Okay.
But it would be good to have an option to meet in person. Kim, did you want to come in?
Yeah. I was just going to say that I think before we started recording, we just started also going through the early years section. So just want to make sure that, particularly the decision around the essentially retained budget is noted for the live meeting.
Thanks, Kim. Well spotted. So for the purposes of the live meeting, the school forum report recommendations, item 1, 2, and 3. Forum have noted the early years consultation, agreed the centrally retained level, and have noted the comment on the proposed use of the early years block.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, forum members and colleagues. Thank you to Kim and Tamara, as usual, as ever, for sterling reporting, and to Cornelia for pushing through on all the technological issues.
Yeah, I do apologise for the late start to the meeting, but it couldn't be helped.
We're all impressed, Cornelia. We think you managed it very well. We thought we were going to have to resort to Tamara leading us in communal singing, but we didn't have to. So that brings us to a close of the meeting. Have a good evening, everybody, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.